The ancient pines of Blackwood Forest had stood sentinel for centuries, their twisted branches reaching toward a sky that seemed perpetually shrouded in mist. Sarah Chen had chosen this remote camping spot precisely because of its isolation, 3 days into the wilderness, far from cell towers and civilization. What she hadn't expected was the overwhelming sense of being watched. It began on the first night. Sarah had pitched her tent in a small clearing, surrounded by towering evergreens that swayed despite the absence of wind. The fire crackled cheerfully, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. She'd just settled into her sleeping bag when she heard it, a low, rhythmic tapping coming from the tree line. Tap. 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 The sound was deliberate, almost like Morse code. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and swept the beam across the darkness beyond her camp. Nothing but trees, their bark scarred with deep gouges that looked disturbingly fresh. "Hello?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. The tapping stopped. Sarah convinced herself it was just a woodpecker, though she'd never heard one active at night. She pulled her sleeping bag over her head and forced herself to sleep, but her dreams were filled with scratching sounds and whispered voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. The second day brought no relief. As Sarah hiked deeper into the forest, she noticed the trees bore increasingly strange markings. The gouges she'd seen the night before appeared everywhere, parallel scratches carved deep into the bark, too wide and too deep to be made by any animal she knew. Some of the marks formed crude symbols that made her skin crawl. Worse were the sounds. Throughout the day, she heard footsteps that seemed to mirror her own, always just out of sync. When she stopped, they stopped. When she turned around, the forest was empty. But the feeling of being stalked never left her. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner over her camp stove, she found the first gift. Arranged in a perfect circle around her tent were 13 pine cones, each one carved with the same strange symbols she'd seen on the trees. They hadn't been there when she'd left that morning, she was certain of it. The precision of their placement sent ice through her veins. Sarah grabbed her satellite phone, desperate to call for help, but the device showed no signal. She was truly alone. As darkness fell, the tapping returned, but this time it came from multiple directions. The sound echoed through the forest like a twisted percussion ensemble, each rhythm slightly different but somehow coordinated. Sarah huddled in her tent, flashlight clutched in her trembling hands, as the symphony of tapping grew louder and more frenzied. Then came the voices. They started as whispers, so faint she thought she was imagining them. But gradually, they grew clearer, though the words remained incomprehensible. The voices seemed to come from the trees themselves, as if the forest was speaking. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all whispering in unison. Sarah pressed her hands over her ears, but the voices seemed to bypass her hearing entirely, resonating inside her skull. The whispers spoke of ancient hungers, of rituals performed beneath moonless skies, of travelers who had wandered too far into the deep woods and never returned. The tent began to shake. Not from wind, there was no wind. The fabric rippled and bulged as if something was pressing against it from the outside, testing its strength. Sarah's flashlight beam wavered as shapes moved beyond the thin nylon walls. The shadows were wrong, too tall and angular to be human. A new sound joined the cacophony, scraping. Long, deliberate scratches against the tent's exterior, like claws or knives being dragged across the fabric. Sarah bit her lip to keep from screaming, tasting blood. The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, Sarah heard her own ragged breathing and the wild hammering of her heart. She waited, muscles tensed, for what felt like hours. Finally, she worked up the courage to peek outside. The forest was empty, but the ground around her tent was disturbed. Footprints, if they could be called that, surrounded her camp. They were elongated impressions in the soil, too long for human feet, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat in the corner of her tent, flashlight in one hand, her grandfather's hunting knife in the other, watching the walls for any sign of movement. The whispers continued until dawn, growing more insistent, more urgent. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, Sarah made her decision. She would break camp immediately and hike back to civilization. But when she emerged from her tent, she discovered her backpack had been moved. It now sat in the center of the carved pinecone circle, and every one of her supplies had been arranged in ritualistic patterns around it. Her water bottles formed a pentagram. Her canned food was stacked in a perfect pyramid. And carved into the dirt beneath her backpack was a symbol so disturbing that looking at it made her vision blur and her stomach lurch. Sarah grabbed her pack and ran. She crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at her clothes and skin, but she didn't stop. The forest seemed to shift around her, paths appearing and disappearing, familiar landmarks rearranging themselves into impossible configurations. She ran for what felt like hours, but the sun never seemed to move in the sky. Finally, exhausted and gasping, Sarah stumbled into a clearing she didn't recognize. In the center stood a massive pine tree, its trunk so wide that a dozen people holding hands couldn't encircle it. The tree was covered in the same strange symbols, but these were different. Older, deeper, as if they'd been carved generations ago. At the base of the tree, arranged in a perfect spiral, were the belongings of other campers. Backpacks, tents, sleeping bags, all in various states of decay. Some looked recent, others had been there for years. And scattered among the equipment were bones, human bones, picked clean and arranged in deliberate patterns. Sarah understood then that she wasn't the first to receive the forest's attention. The whispers grew louder, more triumphant, as if sensing her realization. The trees around the clearing began to sway, their branches reaching toward her like grasping fingers. She turned to flee, but the forest had closed in around her. Where there had been open space moments before, now stood an impenetrable wall of trees. The trunks were so close together that she couldn't squeeze between them, and their branches interlocked overhead, blotting out the sky. The whispers became a roar. Sarah pressed her back against the ancient pine, feeling the rough bark through her shirt. The carved symbols seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and she realized with growing horror that they weren't just decorations, they were instructions. A recipe. A summoning. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and she felt something vast and ancient stirring in the earth below. The forest had been waiting, collecting travelers one by one, feeding them to whatever slumbered beneath the roots of the great tree. As tendrils of shadow began to rise from the soil, reaching for her ankles with eager hunger, Sarah's last coherent thought was a prayer that someone would find her remains and know not to venture into the whispering pines. But deep in her heart, she knew the forest would never let her go. The search party found her campsite 3 days later, but Sarah Chen was never seen again. Her tent remained perfectly intact, her belongings undisturbed except for 13 pine cones arranged in a circle. The only clue to her fate was a message carved into the bark of a nearby tree, the same symbols that had been appearing throughout the forest for decades. The locals say that on certain nights, when the mist is thick and the moon is dark, you can still hear Sarah's voice among the whispers in the pines. They say she's trying to warn others, to tell them to turn back before it's too late. But the forest is hungry, and it's always looking for new guests to add to its collection. Marcus Thompson had been leading wilderness expeditions for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for the Thornwick Valley. The invitation had come through official channels. The Parks Department wanted him to evaluate a potential new campsite deep in the old-growth forest. The pay was generous, almost suspiciously so, and the location was marked only as Sector 7 on the topographical maps. The drive to the trailhead had been unsettling enough. The local ranger station was abandoned, its windows boarded up with no explanation. The gas station attendant in the nearest town had gone pale when Marcus mentioned Thornwick Valley, muttering something about bad ground and things that shouldn't be disturbed. Even his satellite phone had started acting strangely as he approached the forest, picking up strange signals, whispered voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize. He should have known something was wrong when his GPS died the moment he crossed the tree line. The forest felt different here. Ancient. The trees were massive, their trunks twisted into unnatural spirals that hurt to look at directly. The canopy was so thick that midday felt like twilight, and the air itself seemed to press down with suffocating weight. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. The only sound was the soft whisper of wind through branches that shouldn't have been moving. But there were other signs that something was deeply wrong. The bark on many trees bore strange markings, not the random scratches of animals, but deliberate symbols carved deep into the wood. Some looked fresh, others had been there for decades, growing with the trees until they became part of the living wood itself. The patterns made Marcus's eyes water when he tried to focus on them, as if his mind was rejecting what it saw. The undergrowth was wrong too. Plants grew in perfect geometric patterns, forming spirals and pentagrams that couldn't possibly be natural. Flowers bloomed in colors that didn't exist in nature, deep purples that seemed to absorb light, and yellows so bright they hurt to look at. When Marcus bent to examine one more closely, he noticed it had no scent. None of the plants did. The entire forest was beautiful and utterly lifeless. Marcus set up his camp in a clearing that seemed almost too perfect, a circle of bare earth surrounded by towering pines. The ground was soft and dark, as if it had been recently tilled. He noticed there were no fallen leaves, no debris, nothing that should naturally accumulate in a forest clearing. It was as if the earth itself was kept clean by some invisible caretaker. As he hammered in his tent stakes, Marcus noticed they went into the ground with unusual ease, as if the soil had been loosened recently. When he pulled one stake back up to reposition it, clumps of earth fell away, revealing something that made his blood run cold. The dirt was full of small fragments. Pieces of bone, scraps of fabric, and what looked like fingernail clippings. Hundreds of them, as if the soil itself was composed of decomposed organic matter. The smell hit him then. Beneath the clean scent of pine and earth was something else, the sweet, cloying odor of decay. It was faint, but unmistakable once he'd noticed it. The clearing wasn't just clean, it was actively consuming whatever fell into it. The first night passed without incident, though Marcus found himself unable to sleep deeply. His dreams were filled with the sound of digging, rhythmic, purposeful scraping that seemed to come from beneath his sleeping bag. He woke several times, convinced he could feel tremors in the ground, but each time he pressed his ear to the earth, there was only silence. But the silence itself was wrong. In 15 years of wilderness camping, Marcus had never experienced such complete absence of sound. No rustling of small animals, no distant calls of night birds, no buzz of insects. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. At 3 a.m., Marcus was jolted awake by a sound that definitely wasn't natural, a low, resonant humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. The ground beneath his sleeping bag was vibrating, and he could feel the vibrations traveling up through his bones. The humming grew louder, more complex, until it sounded almost like voices singing in harmony. But the melody was alien, disturbing, with notes that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his skull. The humming stopped abruptly at dawn, leaving Marcus exhausted and shaken. He told himself it must have been the wind, or perhaps some kind of geological phenomenon. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. The second day brought discoveries that made his skin crawl. While exploring the perimeter of his campsite, Marcus found the first hollow. It was a perfect circle in the forest floor, about 6 feet across and impossibly deep. When he dropped a stone into it, he never heard it hit bottom. The edges were smooth, as if the earth had been scooped out with surgical precision. Within an hour, he had found 12 more. The hollows formed a rough circle around his camp, each one identical to the last. Some were partially hidden by fallen logs or tangles of undergrowth, but they were all there, waiting. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. These weren't natural formations, they were too uniform, too deliberately placed. He tried to leave that afternoon, but the forest had other plans. The trail he had followed and was gone. Not overgrown or blocked, simply absent, as if it had never existed. The trees seemed to have shifted in the night, rearranging themselves into new configurations. Marcus spent hours trying to find his way out, but every path led him back to the clearing, back to the hollows. As darkness fell, he heard the first sounds from below. It started as a faint scratching, like fingernails on wood. The sound came from the hollow nearest to his tent, a persistent scraping that echoed up from the depths. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and approached cautiously, the beam barely penetrating the absolute darkness of the pit. "Hello?" he called down, his voice swallowed by the void. The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, Marcus heard something else, breathing. Slow, labored inhalations that seemed to come from all around him. He spun the flashlight beam across the clearing, but found nothing. The sound was coming from the hollows themselves, as if the earth was breathing. Marcus backed away from the pit, but the breathing followed him. It grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to fill the entire forest. Each exhalation brought with it a smell, decay and damp earth, like the interior of a freshly dug grave. The scratching resumed, but now it came from multiple hollows. A symphony of scraping sounds, as if dozens of things were clawing their way up from the depths. Marcus retreated to his tent, but the sounds followed him. The scratching was directly beneath his sleeping bag now, separated from him by only a thin layer of nylon and a few feet of soil. Something was trying to dig its way up. Marcus packed his gear in frantic haste, but as he turned to leave the clearing, he found his path blocked. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a figure, tall, gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. In the wavering beam of his flashlight, he could see that it wore the tattered remains of hiking clothes, but its face was hidden in shadow. "You can't leave," the figure said, its voice like wine through dry leaves. "Not yet. They're not finished." More figures emerged from behind the trees. Men and women in various states of decay, all wearing the remnants of camping gear. Their eyes were gone, replaced by hollow sockets that seemed to draw in the light. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Marcus recognized some of them from missing person reports he'd seen over the years. Hikers who had vanished without a trace in the wilderness. They had all found their way here, to this place where the earth itself was hungry. "We tried to leave too," said a woman whose face was half-eaten by something that had crawled out of the soil. "But the hollow ones wouldn't let us. They need us. They need our warmth, our life. They've been waiting so long in the cold dark." The scratching grew louder, more frenzied. Dirt began to fountain up from the nearest hollow, and Marcus saw pale, grasping fingers break through the surface. The things that emerged were barely human, elongated creatures with skin like wet paper and eyes that had never seen sunlight. They moved with the fluid grace of things that had spent eons crawling through underground passages. "They sleep most of the time," the dead woman continued conversationally. "But when someone new arrives, they wake up. They're so hungry, you see. They've been dreaming of the surface world, of warmth and flesh and beating hearts." The hollow ones surrounded Marcus now, their pale fingers reaching for him with desperate hunger. He could see the intelligence in their sunken eyes, the terrible awareness of what they had become. They had once been human, he realized. People who had ventured too deep into the earth and been changed by whatever darkness lived there. "It doesn't hurt," whispered one of the dead hikers, a young man whose throat had been torn open by something with very sharp teeth. "The transformation is actually quite peaceful. You just have to let go of the surface world. Let go of the sun and the sky and the things that no longer matter." Marcus felt cold fingers on his arms, his legs, pulling him toward the largest hollow. He struggled, but the dead were stronger than they looked, and there were so many of them. They dragged him to the edge of the pit, and he could see that it wasn't empty after all. A spiral staircase carved from living rock descended into the earth, disappearing into absolute darkness. "The city below is beautiful," said the dead woman. All crystal and bone and perfect silence. You'll like it there. Everyone does, eventually. As they lowered him into the hollow, Marcus caught a glimpse of what lay beneath the forest. Vast caverns stretched out in all directions, their walls lined with cocoons of silk and earth. Some of the cocoons were moving, their occupants not yet fully transformed. Others hung still and empty, their contents having already joined the ranks of the hollow ones. The staircase spiraled down for what felt like miles, past chambers filled with the accumulated possessions of decades of missing hikers. Backpacks and tents, cameras and climbing gear, all arranged in neat piles like offerings to some underground god. The hollow ones moved through these spaces with purpose, tending to their collections, preparing for the next visitor. Marcus was placed in a cocoon of his own, the silk-like material hardening around him like a second skin. He could feel his memories beginning to fade, his connection to the surface world growing dim. The hollow ones were taking care of him, preparing him for his new existence in the crystal city below. His last coherent thought was a warning he would never be able to deliver: stay away from Thornwick Valley. Stay away from the perfect clearings and the too quiet forest. The earth there is hungry, and it has been waiting for so very long. The Parks Department never heard from Marcus Thompson again. His disappearance was officially classified as an accident, another tragic case of an experienced hiker getting lost in the wilderness. The Thornwick Valley was quietly removed from all development plans, its existence scrubbed from official records. But sometimes, on nights when the earth itself seems to breathe, you can still hear the scratching sounds coming from deep underground. The hollow ones are still there, still waiting, still dreaming of the day when they can return to the surface and bring others down to join them in their perfect, silent city. The forest remembers everything, and it never stops growing hungry. The Feeding Grove. Jenny Martinez had always been drawn to the darkest corners of the wilderness, but Redwood Hollow was different. The local hiking forum spoke of it in hushed tones, a pristine camping spot 3 days deep into the Cascade Mountains, where the trees grew so tall they seemed to touch the sky. What they didn't mention was why the site remained perpetually vacant despite its supposed beauty. The first warning came from the park ranger at the trailhead. He was an old man with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked, studying her permit with obvious concern. "Most folks who head to Redwood Hollow, well, they don't usually come back the same. If they come back at all." Jenny laughed it off. She'd been solo camping for 8 years, had survived blizzards in Alaska and sandstorms in Nevada. A few tall trees weren't going to intimidate her. She should have listened to the ranger. The hike into Redwood Hollow was grueling. 3 days of steep switchbacks and treacherous creek crossings. But it was the subtle wrongness that truly unsettled her. The wildlife grew increasingly sparse as she climbed higher. By the second day, she hadn't seen a single bird or squirrel. Even the insects seemed to avoid certain areas, creating pockets of absolute silence that made her skin crawl. The trees themselves were magnificent but wrong. They towered impossibly high, their trunks so massive that dozens of people holding hands couldn't encircle them. But their bark was covered in strange growths, bulbous protrusions that looked almost like tumors. When Jenny pressed her hand against one, it felt warm and yielded slightly, as if something was moving beneath the surface. The trail markers became increasingly unreliable as she climbed. Some were torn down entirely, others had been altered with crude symbols carved into the wood. The symbols hurt to look at directly, causing her vision to blur and her head to ache. She began to suspect she wasn't the first person to find this place disturbing. On the third day, she found the first body. It was hidden behind a fallen log, barely visible through the undergrowth. The remains were old, reduced to bone and scraps of fabric, but the positioning was wrong. The skeleton was arranged in a perfect spiral, arms and legs bent at impossible angles. Someone had taken great care to pose the corpse, turning death into art. Jenny's hands shook as she photographed the scene with her phone. The device's camera malfunctioned, producing images filled with static and strange shapes that hadn't been visible to her naked eye. When she tried to delete the photos, they reappeared in her gallery, multiplying like a virus. She found 2 more bodies before reaching Redwood Hollow proper. Both were arranged in the same spiral pattern, and both had been there for different lengths of time. The most recent couldn't have been dead for more than a few months. Jenny recognized the hiking boots, expensive, Italian-made, the kind serious backpackers wore. The hollow itself was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. It was a perfect circle of flat ground surrounded by the largest trees she'd ever seen. Each trunk was easily 40 feet in diameter, their bark scarred with deep grooves that formed intricate patterns. The canopy was so thick that the floor of the hollow existed in permanent twilight, lit only by scattered beams of sunlight that filtered through the leaves like spotlights. But it was the silence that truly unnerved her. No wind moved through the trees. No birds sang overhead. The only sound was her own breathing and the soft whisper of her footsteps on the forest floor. Jenny set up her camp in the center of the hollow, though every instinct screamed at her to leave. She told herself she was being paranoid, that the bodies were probably just the result of accidents or animal attacks. But as she hammered her tent stakes into the ground, she noticed the earth was soft, too soft, as if it had been recently disturbed. The first night, she dreamed of roots. They started small, thin tendrils that crept through the soil toward her sleeping bag. But as the dream progressed, they grew thicker, more aggressive, until they were bursting through the floor of her tent and wrapping around her ankles. She woke with a gasp, her heart racing, to find her tent undisturbed. But the dream had felt so real she could swear she still felt the phantom touch of roots against her skin. The second night brought visitors. Jenny was awakened by the sound of footsteps circling her camp. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. She grabbed her flashlight and unzipped her tent, sweeping the beam across the hollow. The light revealed nothing but trees, but the footsteps continued. They were getting closer, more numerous, until it sounded like a small army was marching through the forest around her camp. Jenny called out, but received no response. The footsteps simply continued their endless circuit, never quite approaching her tent but never moving away either. It was then she noticed the trees were moving. Not swaying in the wind, there was no wind. They were shifting position, rotating slowly like enormous dancers. The grooves in their bark were glowing faintly, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. As she watched in horror, the trees began to lean inward, their massive trunks tilting toward her camp like giants preparing to bow. The footsteps stopped. In the sudden silence, Jenny heard something else, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from beneath the ground. It was slow and steady, like a massive heartbeat. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until she could feel it vibrating through her bones. The trees were breathing. She could see it now, the subtle expansion and contraction of their trunks, the way their bark rippled like skin. The bulbous growths she'd noticed earlier were pulsing in time with the underground heartbeat, and she realized with dawning horror that they weren't growths at all. They were organs. The trees were alive in ways that defied everything she thought she knew about nature. Jenny scrambled out of her tent, desperate to escape, but the hollow had changed. Where there had been clear spaces between the trees, now there were only walls of bark and root. The trees had closed ranks, forming an impenetrable barrier around her camp. She was trapped. The heartbeat grew louder, more demanding. The ground beneath her feet began to soften, and she realized the earth was opening up, preparing to swallow her whole. Thin roots erupted from the soil, reaching for her ankles just like in her dream. But these were real, and they were hungry. Jenny ran to the nearest tree, pounding on its bark with her fists. The surface was warm and yielding, and she could feel a pulse beneath her hands. The tree was alive, aware, and it was laughing at her fear. "Please," she whispered, but the forest had no mercy to offer. The roots wrapped around her legs, pulling her down into the soft earth. She clawed at the ground, but her fingers found only more roots, more hungry tendrils that seemed to multiply at her touch. The earth was swallowing her slowly, savoring her terror. As she sank deeper into the soil, Jenny caught glimpses of what lay beneath the hollow. A vast network of roots and tunnels, all connected to the trees above. But these weren't normal roots, they were veins, arteries, carrying nutrients from the forest floor to the living giants above. And the nutrients weren't just decomposed leaves and dead animals. She saw bones embedded in the root walls, human remains that had been processed and absorbed by the forest. The trees weren't just alive, they were predators, and the hollow was their feeding ground. Every hiker who had disappeared in these woods had ended up here, dissolved into the living network that connected the ancient giants. Jenny's last coherent thought was a realization that made her scream: the trees weren't just consuming her body. They were taking her memories, her experiences, her very essence. She would become part of them, another voice in the collective consciousness that had been growing for centuries. The forest rangers found her campsite 4 days later, but Jenny Martinez was gone. Her tent was intact, her gear undisturbed, but there was no sign of what had happened to her. The official report listed her as another missing hiker, probably lost to the wilderness. But the old ranger at the trailhead knew better. He'd seen too many permits for Redwood Hollow over the years, and he'd filed too many missing person reports. The forest was hungry, and it was getting bolder. Soon, it would no longer be content with the occasional hiker who wandered too far from the marked trails. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind was still, the ranger could hear singing coming from the direction of the hollow. Voices in harmony, dozens of them, all the hikers who had fed the trees over the decades. They sang of the beauty of becoming one with the forest, of the peace that came with surrendering to something larger than themselves. The ranger always made sure to close his windows on those nights. He'd learned long ago that the forest's song was seductive, and he was getting old. His resistance was weakening, and he feared that one day he might answer the call. The trees were patient. They had been waiting for centuries, and they could wait a little longer. But they were always hungry, and Redwood Hollow was always ready for new visitors.